Hello, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a minute just to kind of get jumped in. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Okay. All right, great. I guess this is a good point for us to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Jason Randall. I am a youth supervisor at Tropicana Community Services, but most of all, I'm here to be your host for this exciting event that we have. And we definitely have a special guest who's going to be sharing her experience in a moment, but I did want to just cover some quick housekeeping as we go forward. Number one is this session is going to be recorded, so please be advised for that. Also, after the week goes through and everything is completed, then you'll have an opportunity later on to actually be involved and to have a chance to check out this session with amongst many other sessions for Black Mental Health Week. But I just wanted to go over something very quickly, what this week is about. This week is designed to support positive mental health for Black communities and individuals by providing alternative ways to support mental health and wellness. So this year's event will work, again, to aim the voices of the Black community and to bring much needed awareness, and also to give a historical context and current effects of systemic anti-Black racism on mental health and wellness. The theme for Mental Black Health for 2023 is Be You, Be Well. And our presenter today will be talking with that in mind in general. So I did want to just cover who actually is our speaker today. We have Desiree Phillips, and I just wanted to read something very quickly about her bio. She is a registered psychotherapist and a equity consultant based out of Markham, Ontario. As a equity consultant and trainer, Desiree designs and facilitates various activities for organizations at all levels, including executive management, frontline administration, and supportive staff. Also, she uses her expertise in training, counseling, and advocacy, along with a passion for equity to design and deliver various training and consultation activities worldwide for numerous organizations and across past before. So go ahead, Desiree, you can go ahead and share with us this exciting topic today about Hear My Voice, Not My Behavior.
Thanks so much, Jason, and welcome everyone. Really excited to be here with you today and really excited to get into the conversation that speaks to the impacts of racism on our children and children's mental health. So thank you for allowing me to share today. As we get started, I just want to take the opportunity to recognize the land and the space that we occupy. Regardless of where you are participating from today, we just like to acknowledge that the land that we are on is the traditional territory of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And specifically, Toronto is built up on the traditional lands of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, Huron-Wendat people, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also want to acknowledge that those of us who are non-Indigenous, who are settlers here, recognize how we came to be on these lands and the facts that we reap privilege on Indigenous land in ways that Indigenous people to this point are still unable to do. And so in that, recognizing that when we hear land acknowledgements, that it's our responsibility to recognize how we came to reap the benefits of the atrocities experienced by Indigenous people. We also recognize that living on this territory makes all of us treaty people, and we have a responsibility to care and share for this land. So those who are settlers or immigrants of this generation or previous generations, as well as those who were brought to this land involuntarily through the transatlantic slave trade, and through colonialism and imperialism, understand that now we hold space on this land and have a responsibility to share and care and connect with one another on this land. And so I appreciate you taking the opportunity in the moment to do that. And I hope we would continue to do that moving forward. As we carry on, really getting a sense of how we want to be together in the space, I really appreciate people being connected and logged on this afternoon. I encourage you to be present, not just physically present, but mentally, emotionally connected to the conversation. I encourage you to be honest about your experiences, your thoughts, your perspectives, and your journey, and be open to hearing and considering things in a different way than you may have before, but also open to sharing when the opportunity provides. I encourage us to be brave and courageous as we embark on this really important but yet challenging conversation about racism and our children, and really thinking about how we can show grace to ourselves and others as we learn and grow together in this conversation. So if we're going to be talking about race, we really want to understand what race is and understand this idea of race. Because oftentimes we think of race and our racial identities as being a biological or genetic thing, but the reality is that it is not genetic or biological. That race is actually a social construct that has been created by people in society. So based on things like geography or culture, or even physical features, among other things, people in society have come up with this idea of race, and as such have put certain people in different boxes based on our ideas about what they represent. And although these are not real legitimate ways to classify people, as a society, we have accepted and adopted these ideas about who fits under what racial group, and we have acted accordingly. Now, these things have then resulted in biological and genetic impacts on certain groups of people, but race itself is not biological. So I'll give you an example. If anyone knows or is of Irish or even Italian descent, those identities were not considered white at one point. Those identities were brought into whiteness at a later time based on economic and social factors. So when we even think about who fits into which box, understand that over time that has shifted because it's not biological, it's socially constructed. People in society decide. But for a long, long time now, we have accepted the boxes as they are, if you will. And so we have reaped the impacts and experiences of being classified and categorized under certain racial groups. And what has resulted from that is the experience of racism. And racism is something that is the very legitimate outcome of this really illegitimate type of categorization that we've experienced. And what racism is not just prejudice or discrimination, but it's prejudice plus power that is used in tandem to create a system of oppression based on race, or the boxes people have been put in. And this system allows one group of people to exercise power over others on the basis of skin color, on the basis of their racial group. And it plays out in so many ways in our society through our belief systems or our assumptions about ourselves and others that are all rooted in this ideology that there's one group that's inherently superior or better than others. And in that, we're experiencing the results of that in our institutions, our structures, our organizations, but also on the individual level. When we think about our own thought patterns, our own behavior patterns that reflect this idea of one race being superior to all the others. And when we think about what that plays out as, we understand that in society, those who hold identities of whiteness have been put in that place of superior or ideal in our society. And this plays out at various levels of our society, because this system of oppression isn't just in one scenario or one situation. It's not an isolated incident, but we see racism playing out across our systems at the high level of structural and systemic racism, where we see it playing out in our governments, our laws, our policies, our organizations, our school systems, our child welfare systems, our justice system, our healthcare system. And these are at the macro level. We also see racism playing out at the meso level or the micro level, the interpersonal level. Things that happen within us and between people. So with our relationships with teachers and peers, family members, community members, this is how racism plays out in that personally mediated interaction. And then in the center, you'll see how racism plays out on an internalized level. This is not what happens outside of us or between us, but within us as individuals. How do we feel about ourselves? How do we view ourselves and our own experiences within our identity? And at every level, we can see racism playing out and informing and reinforcing racism at the various other levels to create this overarching experience that shapes how people who hold Black identity walk through the world and how the world experiences them. So when we think about our kids specifically and how this plays out, oftentimes we'll hear things like, well, our kids are not having the same experiences, or, this generation's so much better than our previous generations, or, we're better than our parents and our kids are better than us. But the reality is our children are experiencing racism today in the same way that we did and our parents did in many of the same spaces. And although sometimes it plays out slightly differently, they're having the same negative impacts on all these different levels. So for example, on that systemic and structural level, we see racism impacting our children in places like the school environment, right? Do they have access to different types of school, different types of academic programming? For any of you who may have students in high school, when they think about choosing courses and getting into different programs and different levels, they say that, streaming doesn't happen anymore, but we know that that doesn't happen necessarily in a formal way, but oftentimes in informal ways, and what's recommended to them, what programs they're put in. Are they identified as gifted or are they identified as behavioral? These are all ways that it plays out in that systemic level. Thinking about the resources that are availed to our students, our children, the punishments that they get, harsher punishment for lesser behaviors. We know that in our school systems, and not just in Toronto, but across North America, Black children get expelled and suspended at disproportionate rates. And not only thinking about the fact that they're getting more suspensions and expulsions, but what those suspensions are for. What we found is that even though there's really clear criteria in the Education Act and in our school policy about what behavior warrants suspension, a large portion of the suspensions given to Black students are for what are known as discretionary behaviors. So at the discretion of administrators. In one school board in Ontario, it was 78% of the suspensions given to students that were Black were not in that listed criteria. And we also see just white supremacy at large in our school system. And when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm not talking about the KKK or burning crosses. But this idea that things that are rooted in a Eurocentric experience and identities of whiteness are the norm, are the center, are the core of everything we experience in our different spaces, whether it be childcare, child rearing, families, education, that the baseline and ideal is still rooted in whiteness. And we also see it playing out in that personally mediated way in different ways. So we have microaggression, those everyday interactions, words, behavior, things in our environment that harm, that stereotype, that insult and demean our children in their identities, that tell them they're not good enough or they're not normal, that they're not supposed to be smart, or they have to fit a certain stereotype to be really Black. Do you dance? Do you play sports? What do you mean you can't play basketball? All of these things are how these interactions play out amongst relationships. These assumptions about what their abilities are, about what they should be good at and what they're not cut out for, whether they have good motives or bad motives, whether they can be trusted or not, whether they're being malicious or disruptive, and just really how they are characterized by people around them. Thinking about their inaccurate evaluation of their abilities. Are they measured by the same way? What are the ways that the goalpost is always moved for them? or their behaviors are interpreted in a negative light. The way that they are seen as older than their age, adultified, sexualized, criminalized. And this results in strained relationships between authority figures, family members, community members, and all supports biases against Black bodies, even when they're children. I'm not sure if folks had heard in the news just today on CP24, I watched this morning about the 6-year-old boy who was locked into a small room in the office for over half an hour, and how he'd been separated from his classmates, made to sit at a far desk that was full of graffiti and unkind words. And the rationale was he was disruptive to the other students. These are the ways that racism are playing out in our interactions and relationships. And all of that informs what happens within. How do we as individuals, how do our children see themselves? And this is where we see racism playing out at an internalized way, where our children and ourselves who hold Black identity internalize the stereotypes about ourselves, what we have to do, what we're supposed to be good at, what we're supposed to believe about ourselves. And we take in all those negative beliefs about our own value, our own worth, our own abilities and capacity, and act accordingly. And so all of these realms, we see racism weaving its way into the lives and well-being, or lack thereof, for our children, who then become young adults and full adults and elders. And we're not exempt. Children are not exempt from these experiences. It just plays out in different environments sometimes and in different ways, but has just as significant an impact on their well-being as it does on any of us who have endured this throughout our lives. So it's really important that as adults in these children's lives, we really have a good grasp of internalizations. What does it mean for us, even who hold Black identity, to contribute to the harm by internalizing these negative messages about our own identity? And so when I talk about internalizations, what I'm talking about are all of these images and stereotypes and myths that have been promoted in our society through our racist systems about who we are as Black people. And the thoughts that we have about ourselves and about others who hold our identity versus those who hold other racial identities. And how these have been all rooted in these very racist messages that we've received time and time again from all of the places around us. And when we internalize these things ourselves, we can make comments, we can have expectations, we can misunderstand and misevaluate things, even to ourselves and to people within our own community. And this is what internalized racism looks like. Oftentimes we talk about racism thinking about what outside individuals are doing to people within the Black community. And we don't often recognize how racism lives and breathes not only within our community, but within ourselves, because we too have heard the messages. I often say there was no separate classroom for the white kids and the Asian kids and the Black kids and the Indigenous kids. There was one classroom and we all sat in it. And we all heard the same messages about what it means to be white and what it means to be Black and what it means to be Asian and what it means to be Indigenous. We heard messages about ourselves and we heard messages about others. And we too were informed by those messages and had those messages reinforced in our interactions. So what does internalized anti-Black racism look like? How do we know we're being impacted? Where do we see it manifest? Well, there are a number of ways. Well, one of the ways is denying racism. Sometimes as Black people, or we may hear Black people say, well, it's not racism. I don't experience racism. It's, just their poor choices. And really dismissing the impact that racism is having on our lives and how we experience the world. So this denial of racism, a refusal to acknowledge the way that race is playing a role and how that system of oppression is playing out, can be evidence of internalized racism, just dismissing the reality of the situation. Sometimes this is intentional, and sometimes this is a protective factor because it's hard to deal with racism, right? So sometimes we can just take what we think is an easier route and just ignoring or not acknowledging it, because acknowledging the magnitude of it can be really a heavy load to bear. We also see anti-Black racism within the Black community and internalized in people in the form of shadeism or colorism. And we see this is the type of discrimination based on complexion. You know, the lighter you are, the brighter, the better. No one wants to be too dark. Don't go play in the sun too long. We hear this within the community. And what those ideas reflect is anti-Blackness and an aspiration to whiteness. Things that are closer in proximity to whiteness being more desirable, more ideal, even within our own communities. When we see this also playing into hair texture and who we say has good hair or hard hair or nappy hair, and really giving those positive messages to things that are associated with white identity and all the negative messages associated with things of dark and Black identity. We also see anti-Black racism internalized when we hear mistrust or suspicion of other Black people. So this may play out in thinking that, you know, a Black professional may not be as qualified, or maybe they're not as truthful, or be suspicious of other people, or not wanting to be around people within the community, trying to distance ourselves from our own community members. That can be evidence of anti-Black racism internalized, believing that there's some bad motive or, you know, underhanded idea, or you're not going to get as good a service from someone who's Black compared to someone who's white. This also speaks to this idea of seeking white approval. I don't know if anyone's seen the Netflix Colin Kaepernick in Black and White, but he talks about this looking for the, you know, the white seal of approval. And this plays out when those who hold Black and racialized identity might hear positives, might hear a compliment from someone else who holds Black identity, and that's good. But when a white person tells you that it's good, then you really did good. And do we seek out that seal of approval from whom we think has kind of that higher standard or a higher position when we're looking, whether it's in school, in our workplaces, in our community? Do we value that approval more than the approval of members within our own community? That can be an indication of internalized racism. We also see people who hold Black identity be harsher critics of the actions of Black people. This comes in comments such as, you know, Black people are their own worst enemy. Or, you know, maybe we see some young people on the bus, some teenagers who are, you know, being, you know, very energetic and boisterous, laughing, talking, joking. And you'll hear some older persons in the community who are, you know, adults and elders say, well, look at those kids. They're acting so rowdy. They're making the whole community look bad. You know, why don't they act so Black? Even though all the teenagers are laughing and joking and having a good time, because that's what teenagers do. And yet we can be harsher on individuals within our own community, holding them to a different standard and interpreting their behavior in a more negative light than we would others who don't hold Black identity. That's another example. And overall, really just understanding how we can actively and sometimes passively just buy in to the stereotypes about Black people. You might hear, what do you mean you can't dance? Or what do you mean you can't play basketball? We're going to take away your Black card. You're going to get your Black card revoked. Oh, why are you talking so white? Or you're a coconut or an Oreo. You're not really Black. Because we ascribe Blackness to a certain way of speaking or being that buys into these stereotypes about our identity. And an important thing to recognize is that stereotypes are a problem. Stereotypes are always problematic because stereotypes were never made up by the people they're about. Stereotypes were created by other people outside about people in the community. And when we buy into that, we reinforce that it's a thing. And it really generalizes our expectations of people who hold Black identity and forces us to live in this small little box that was created for us, not by us. And that can be a way that we internalize racism, the messages that have been delivered about who we are supposed to be in the world. And how, when we do that as members of the community, do children hear, see, and also internalize those messages about who they're supposed to be and what their identity is, and what does that look like for who they are in the world. Now, we have to remember that these ideas didn't come from nowhere. We were all taught these messages. And so this image that you see is the cycle of socialization. And it speaks to how we've come to believe the things we believe, adopt the beliefs we have about ourselves and others. And at the top of this image, you'll see the beginning. And that's when we enter into the world. When we enter into the world, we're little babies. We have no information, very little information, misinformation, and we are, a clean slate, if you will. But we enter into a world that already exists, that has messages and systems and structures already at play. And so we enter into our first socializations, into our families of origin, our caregivers, our parents, grandparents, family members. And from that very point of our birth, we start to receive messages. You may hear things about who's so cute and whose nose do we need to pull up a little straighter? Who's gonna have that good hair? Or who do we have to be careful they might get too dark? We hear this as infants, as toddlers, as children, even within our homes, within our families, within our close networks, that cause us to learn about ourselves and others. We learn about who's safe and who's not safe. Who do we get handed to as children and who do we never see in our circles? And from that first socialization, we learn. And then we enter the greater world and we start to be informed by institutional and cultural things. Television, social media, our faith organizations, schools, childcare, the greater society. And then there are messages that are given there. And some of those messages reinforce what we've been learned at home. And some of them contradict. Some of them tell us about whether or not we're beautiful, regardless of what our families told us. They tell us whether or not we're smart or capable. And those voices become amplified in our society because we hear them everywhere we go. Whether you're at childcare or at the playground, in your schools, in the workplace, on TV, on social media, and the messages continue. And so all these seeds have been planted, and then they get watered. And then they're reinforced in the enforcement stage, where we start to challenge what we've learned. And we see who gets promoted and who gets punished, and who gets the job and who doesn't, and who's on the news and who's in the jails, and who's on the movie screens, and who's in positions of power. And these things reinforce the things we've been taught and solidify in our minds the accuracy of the messages that we've received. And the results? Racism, internalized dominance, people questioning their own abilities, their capabilities, putting themselves in certain spaces and removing themselves from certain places because we've been told where we should and shouldn't be. And those things serve the next generation. Because then we get back to the beginning where our children are also then taught and learn these same messages. And at the heart of this cycle are things like fear and ignorance, insecurity and confusion that hold people prisoner to this cycle of false identity, this cycle of myth and beliefs and biases that are rooted in nothing more than the messages we've been given. that we've adopted as true. Now, if we want to break out of this, we have to understand that it's going to take a conscious effort to change. Cycles are easy to get sucked into, right? Because we're going with the flow. We see things, we learn things, we do things, we reinforce things, and it's easy to do business as we've always done it. What's hard is to step out of the cycle and think about how we're going to change. But that is what is required. Because when we don't, racism continues to take root and become replicated in our different spaces and throughout generations. And what does that result in? Well, there are many impacts and outcomes of racism on our children and on the next generation. We see a prevalence of mental health concerns in children and youth in terms of depression and anxiety, things like mental illness, and they have an eroded self-perception and understanding of their own capacity. When they've been told they're not good at something or they're not cut out for something, they start to believe it. And it tears away at how they see themselves and the value that they have in the world. We see social determinants of health impacting their physical well-being, their physical health, because we know our social and emotional and relational interactions impact our mental well-being as well as our physical well-being. And we start to see, low weight, less weight gain, more illnesses. I talked about depression and anxiety as well, and low self-esteem. And it can also cause a sense of helplessness. When no one is acknowledging what they're experiencing, when they feel isolated in their spaces, when they're continually given the messages of not good enough and bad, it becomes overwhelming. And then we can see an internalizing of this sense of hopelessness. We might also see it in anger and conduct problems. When we think about our children being characterized as aggressive or angry, being diagnosed with different types of conduct disorders, behavioral disorders, not understanding that the behaviors that they may be exhibiting are not because they are disordered, but because of the constant negative energies, messages, and actions that they receive on a daily basis because of the identities that they hold. This also results in a decline in their academic achievement. When we see grades lowering, a disconnect from school, a disinterest in participating in school. And oftentimes these are then connected to a diagnosis or a learning disability, and a failure to understand that when we talk about children experiencing racism in school environments, just like the example I said earlier, that little boy had been separated from his peers in the classroom. Well, how do you learn and how do you interact in a healthy way in a classroom where you're pulled aside and isolated? And so that will result in a decline in academics, not because of your lack of intelligence or lack of interest, but simply the ways that racism plays out in a classroom environment. We also see it when we talk about suspensions and expulsions. Well, if you're not at school, you're not getting instruction. You're not there when the class is taught or the review happens. You're not there to partner with your classmates to learn and practice your skills. That too will result in a decline in academic achievement. We also see it playing out in things like stereotype threat. And what stereotype threat is this fear of doing things that will make your group look bad, a fear of falling into the stereotype and making your group look worse than it's already perceived. And so you'll see children and adults conduct themselves in certain ways to try to mitigate or diminish these negative ideas that people have about them. And in doing that, they're doing double duty. So you think about how hard it is to focus on your schoolwork and your friends, and then also on top of that, having to act in a certain way above and beyond what is reasonable for children your age or people your age, just so you don't make your people look bad. that your identity group look bad, your racial group look bad. Now, the unfortunate reality is, no matter what the behavior, it doesn't actually change the stereotype, because stereotypes are built to last. So even when children and adults and young people are acting in certain ways to hopefully give another narrative, their behaviors can still be looked through and assessed through that lens of bias that is based on race. We also see this playing out in a decline in belief in their own abilities, being disheartened and discouraged about what they're capable of, a decline in resiliency, not being able to manage and navigate the bumps of life that are, not unusual to anyone. We also see an increase in the number of friends that children are hanging out with that are not interested in school or have behavior problems. Sometimes I've had parents say, well, they started hanging out with the wrong crowd, or they started being influenced by their friends, and not recognizing that when you've been characterized in a certain way for so long, you can seek acceptance in groups where people anticipate you to be. When people make assumptions about you, you can be drawn to those spaces. And so you might see them surrounding themselves with persons that you might think, well, don't hold the same values, or don't want the same things, or have the same goals. And it's not because of their acts of being malicious, but really understanding how and why they surround themselves with the people they do based on the racism that they're experiencing and how they're being characterized. You may see decreased motivation, and this can come from efforts being unrewarded and their energies and contributions being discredited. And we also see bystanders to racism experiencing significant trauma themselves. So even when they are not on the receiving end directly, the indirect impacts of racism are harmful. Observing racism in your community, toward your peers, toward your family members, has psychological and physiological impact on the individuals who are watching and onlooking. I'm sure any of you who watch the news or see things in the media where racism is playing out, although you may not know that person personally or be connected, it still impacts you in a very real way. Because when you hold that identity as well, the reality settles in that it could very easily be you. And you get that sense of disempowerment and discouragement and hopelessness, as well as fear of the reality of this being something that could unfold in your life or the lives of someone that you care for, whether it be a friend or a family member. So there are a multitude of impacts of racism. And so when our children experience this, but as adults, we don't acknowledge the gravity of the situation because they're children, we can sometimes inadvertently make it worse. We can make it worse by ignoring or dismissing those experiences as being legitimate. We can make it worse by invalidating it, saying things like, well, it doesn't excuse your, well, it doesn't matter what they do, you have to, and not validating how hard a burden it is and how hurtful and painful it is to experience those types of racism in our different environments. When we're invalidating them, it makes it worse. We can also blame the children. That makes it really challenging for them to feel heard, to feel safe, when not only are they experiencing the racism, but then get blamed. Well, if you just pulled up your pants, well, if you just talked, well, if you didn't drag your feet, well, I told you to cut your hair, well, I told you to brush your hair, well, if you would just, and not understanding that the circumstances that our children are experiencing, the racism they're experiencing, is never their fault. It is not the choices, decisions, or lack thereof of Black people that results in racism. Racism is the system that's already there. And when we place blame on the person who's experiencing the harm, we make it worse. We can also fail to be supportive in these situations. Sometimes, we have lots of things going on. We have our own lives. We're experiencing our own examples of racism. And when children aren't supported in those spaces, when they are not advocated for, when they are not endorsed to be truthful and to speak to their true realities, that can make it more challenging for them to navigate, because not only are they navigating the initial racism, but now they're navigating it alone without the capacity, the intellect, the experience in their childlike self to know how to navigate that well. So it's really important that we don't fail to support them in that and help build their capacity to navigate it in the future. And finally, when they're not believed. Sometimes, particularly when children are displaying problematic behavior or inappropriate behavior, as it can be seen, and they speak to why, it can be characterized as an excuse. That's an excuse you're giving, and we don't believe that they are experiencing the hardship that they are. Sometimes it's not obvious, or sometimes they don't have the words to articulate what's happening. But when we look at from the outside in, we can understand the nuance of racism. It's not always cut and dry. It's not always blatant in your face. And sometimes the subtleness of those actions, of that isolation, of those negative messages can go overlooked and leave children feeling like they're not believed, or having us question the legitimacy of their experience. All of these actions and reactions by adults, caregivers, and parents makes the racism even harder for them to manage. So in order to mitigate that, we have to not just step out and change, but enter into a new cycle, the cycle of liberation. It's waking up to the fact that racism is a thing. It's impacting people of all ages, including our children. And we have to get ready. We have to prepare ourselves, open ourselves up to having these conversations, to hearing their unique experiences, to learning about how racism is impacting them and how it's been impacting us in perhaps ways we haven't even noticed. Because racism is so commonplace, it becomes business as usual, and we can get comfortable in that replication. So we have to be able to open ourselves up and do our internal work so that we can start then reaching out. Start having conversations with people who look like us and who don't look like us, calling out racism and labeling it as appropriate. And as we continue to reach out, we can start building community. It's important for us who hold Black identity to build community within Black identity. Those who have similar experiences, those who understand the nuance of racism, those who can validate and provide a safe space to have open and honest conversations is really important for us. How do we build community, and how do we equip our children to build community? As I mentioned earlier, sometimes there can be the encouragement not to have too many Black friends or to hang out in other spaces. And while it's good to have a range of relationships, it's also really important to build community within our own identity. And in addition to that, not in place of that, to build community outside of our identity, build community with identities outside of Blackness, bring in conversation and connect with people who hold different identities, who hold different privilege and power, and build allies who can speak and experience and move in spaces differently than we can within the community. And in building those two types of community, we can then coalesce, bring those efforts together, and be strategic about how we position ourselves, how we articulate things, how we move and advocate for one another so that we can start creating change. Not just change in our interpersonal experiences, but change on a systemic level. How do we see policy differently? How do we make practice difference in our schools, in our homes, in our environments to change the systems that we work within? Now, unlike the other cycle I spoke about, the heart of this cycle is joy and balance, self-esteem, self-love, and support that allows people in their Black identity to challenge those negative messages and really start to feel good about who they are in all their diversity. We are not just one group that are all the same. There's a lot of difference and diversity within the Black identity, whether we come from a Caribbean background, a North American background, a continental background, the faith practices that we have, our genders, our various aspects of our identity, which create new experiences, unique experiences, and really embracing that identity of Blackness in all our unique ways. That's the core of the cycle of liberation. And so as adults interacting with children, working with children, having children, it's a matter of modeling this cycle and in building the capacity for our children to do the same. So when we think about what that looks like, it's really important that even as individuals who hold Black identity, as well as those who don't, that we start to get really aware about our personal racial bias and our internalizations. What are the ways that we participate in racism against others and against ourselves and our own identities? Bringing that to our consciousness so that we are better able to cut it out. You often say, stop co-signing on racism. We also have to be willing to talk to our children about racism and call it what it is. Call racism racism. This doesn't mean going around and calling people racists, but being able to call a thought, a behavior, an attitude racist. As opposed to labeling people, let's label racism, because that will give our children the language to be able to understand what's happening, to understand what they're going through and know that it's not them, that it's not their fault. We have to identify, acknowledge, and validate the racism that both ourselves and our children are experiencing. Research has shown that when parents ignore and deny racism, it has a negative detriment not only on themselves, but their children. And that if we want to empower and liberate, we have to not only acknowledge what's happening for others, but what's happening for ourselves. Being able to acknowledge and validate our own experiences of racism, as difficult as they are, because in that acknowledgement, there is healing. In that acknowledgement, there is liberation for ourselves and those who are watching us, which are our young ones. They are watching what we do. They are watching not only how we treat them, but how we treat ourselves. And in doing that, consider racism a serious thing that is worth the energy, the effort, and the conversation. It is a big deal, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that piece of it so our children feel that they can also bring it to our attention and have it acknowledged and validated. And not only do we have to acknowledge and validate it, but then we have to do something about it. We want to make sure that we are actively responding to experiences of racism, the ones that we experience, that our children are watching, but also the ones that they are experiencing themselves. We have to respond. Now, what that response is going to look different for each of us, and there's no one right way. But ensuring that we respond, that we acknowledge and do something about it. Whether we speak into the space and challenge that idea, whether we write a letter, whether we have a meeting, whether we, create some learning, we have to do something. We have to take action so that we can model for our children that it is important for them to do the same. Understanding what's safe. When I say take action, there's a time and place for everything. And knowing who we are and how we are characterized is important so that we maintain safety while doing our particular response. But just ensuring that whatever that response is falls into the cycle of liberation and not the cycle of socialization. Something that's going to make you feel good feel empowered, and love yourself in your identity in its fullness, that will help us move forward and navigate. And at the heart of everything, it is so important for us as adults to build and model a strong, positive Black identity for our children, to be able to encourage, to dismantle the negative messages and fill them with positive, strong messages, that they don't need to be ashamed of their Blackness. They don't need to be ashamed of their dark complexion or their nose or their hair or the way they speak or their accents or their roots or their ancestries, that all of that is good, and not push them to ascribe to whiteness. And what do I mean by that? That they have to live within the box that they've been prescribed. My mother used to be really upset with me when I wore my hair like this. When I first started to wear my hair natural, she'd be like, "Are you going to work like that? You can't go out like that. You're not going to comb your hair. What is happening?" And we want to steer away from that and really allow our children to see that their Black is beautiful. It is strong, it is good, and they don't have to silence that or diminish that in any way to be good and to be successful in the world. And so, as we are coming to kind of the close of our session, any thoughts, questions, concerns that folks would like to share in the space? You can throw it in the chat, you can unmute yourself and just speak in the space. But really encourage folks to kind of share their own perspectives on this, or examples maybe that they have for themselves and their children. Quiet bunch.
I'll say I really enjoyed the cycle of liberation, just because it's so important for us to just kind of um, enforce these positive things to our youth, for them to, for them to understand how important their self-image is and love is and joy, making sure that we're able to put those and feed that to our youth so that they're able to grow in those type of areas.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. Really important not only that we teach it, that we model it. How often as, Black adults, for those of us who hold Black identity, do we model that? Do we embrace our identity? Do we celebrate that? Do we really show joy and what that can look like within our identities? And I also encourage folks to think about the cycle in terms of your responses. Because sometimes I think, well, you have to speak out in the moment and that's going to make you feel good. Or, you have to do this or do that. And really evaluating for ourselves, what is going to make us feel good and empowered? Maybe it's not speaking in that moment, but speaking in a safe space later with someone who's going to validate that. Or maybe it is, articulating that in a moment. But really knowing for yourself what is going to bring you that joy and peace and healing in a way that you're going to feel good about moving forward. And thank you for the comments in the chat. As a child psychologist who works within the school system, I really appreciate your perspectives on Black children's experience within that system. Absolutely. And I thank you for that comment. The school system's a huge one. It's a huge one because it's built on a Eurocentric perspective, right? And our children are not always being perceived as being capable or being intelligent or being suitable for many things. And so I encourage parents, pay attention. Pay attention to your children's school. Sometimes silence is not a good thing. Sometimes they're being ignored. Sometimes no news is not good news. And so be active, be involved, be in communication with your children's teachers, with their school systems. Look at their work. Are they being left aside? Are there, I'll give a quick example. My son had a C on his report card in, I think it might have been grade 4. And when I went to the parent-teacher night, the teacher had not brought it to my attention. So I get to the C and I'm like, well, what about this C here? Like, this is not okay. And the teacher's like, oh, what are you worried about? A C is completely average for him. He's very good at sports. And so I took a breath. I needed to take a sip of breath, I'm not gonna lie. And I said, yeah, he is very good at sports, but I don't send him here to play sports. I send him here to read books. And this is actually not average for him because in kindergarten, he was the only child that could fully read and write when he walked in the door. So for him to have a C in language was not average for him, but that is what she saw. She saw a Black boy who could play ball, and that was all that mattered. So it didn't concern her that he got a C in language. So when we're thinking about how our children are experiencing racism, it's not the mean teacher who's calling him the N-word. It can be the teacher who doesn't recognize their potential and is not bringing to your attention something on the report card, or is not investing in their academic acceleration because they don't think they're capable, and that a C is normal for them. Thanks, Kim. I realized that I have internalized a lot of anti-Black racism, as my parents didn't want me to be stereotyped while being the token Black girl in elementary school. So I can relate to the idea of listening to children and letting them be kids. Racism is indeed not our fault. Absolutely. And I can relate, growing up thinking, it was better to have the white friends and make sure my hair was straight and speak the Queen's English and not use my accent, and all of these things that we've been told by our parents in an effort to protect us. I would say, to their credit, they were trying to do us a favor, but in doing that, sometimes they've diminished who we were and who we see ourselves as. And so really allowing ourselves to move past those internalizations of what we think is good and ideal. As a therapist and social worker, I appreciate that you shared, and I hope that this training can be shared with a wider community. Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. And thanks also, Farai, for the presentation. Really self-evaluation, recognizing our own traumas that contribute to support the very systems that we're working to address and challenge under the guise of making our children stronger, yet it reinforces so many of the negatives of our children's experience. Absolutely. And I encourage folks, there's a fine line between protecting them and diminishing them. There are things we have to tell our children as Black adults, as Black parents. Guess what I tell my kids? If you get pulled over, my dude, speak soft, speak slow, don't move quickly, do as you're told. It's not the time to assert your rights because they don't sell babies at Walmart. And we'll deal with it when you get home, but I need you to get home first. Understanding, acknowledging racism, acknowledging the inequities, and keeping them safe, but doing so in a way that doesn't diminish them and make it feel like it's about them, and understanding the systems that we live within. Build them up in who they are, and challenge ourselves, right? I have been the mom that says, you're not going to cut your hair? Why do you want to go? You need a haircut. You're going to comb it? Please, beg you. But understanding that I need to break out of that idea that it's not only, the low haircut that is appropriate, that I've been told my whole life about, what looks professional and what looks good. And so I really encourage folks, and I thank you so much for your thoughts and contributions and reflections. As we continue this journey, we're all on it. When we talk about navigating racism for ourselves and our children, it's not just about what the world's doing to us, but sometimes how the world has become in us and we replicate it in ourselves. So I really encourage you to reflect on that and how we move in the world, and as Black people, how we can co-sign on racism and how we need to challenge that for not only our own benefit, but for the well-being of our children. Marissa's put in the chat a survey, and we encourage folks to take a moment to do that, if you will, and please give your honest feedback. And thank you so much.